So there we are, writing our code, and it occurs to us that we have many different ways to create something like my name, my address, and my phone number. And while we may choose to use Camel Case, I like Camel Case a lot when I'm simply doing documentation, believe it or not, there's a preferred way of doing business, and as we probably know, there are the Python enhancement proposals, and in this case, there's one that is actually a style guide called PEP-8. Now, the interesting thing about PEP-8 is it does note that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, and while I agree that it's really nice to understand what our modules and functions and classes look like, I wanted to make sure that you are aware of PEP-8 because the standard is indeed evolving, and one of the big changes between Python 3 was making things align with the new standards. So what are those standards? Well, in other programming languages, and in my examples, I feel free to say something like my name equal a string, or my age equals an integer, or my change equals whatever you might have in your pocket. Lots of change. Now, the interesting thing is what we have here is nothing that is supported by the PEP standards. As a matter of fact, you may also change things to being my with a capital, and what we've done basically is name something the way we should a class, once again, not supported by the standard. What the standard says we should do is to keep everything lowercase, and in this case, at the time of this recording, if I want it to be completely compliant with the PEP, all of our variables, functions, as well as class member names, no matter whether we're using one word or two, they should always be lowercase. And I've got no problem with that standard whatsoever. And it really makes things predictable. And I try to stick to it whenever I can. But it is an extra space to type. And so there's another way of naming some things, certainly our variables that I like to talk about today, called Hungarian notation. And the reason why I like Hungarian notation, of course, is because as our programs get complicated, for example, if I had a class called user info and following PEP-8, and if I wanted to create a class and assign it to name, you can see that I don't really know what's going on here. And if I was teaching people, they might be confused and think that my name could be a string, and that could be a problem as we move through time. So what Hungarian notation allows us to do is to introduce some light identification prefixes that we can use to make sure we understand, in this case, that my name isn't going to be a string. Instead, it could be an instance of UI, user info, name. Now, while UI, in some people's minds, says user interface, of course, another way we might choose to use this variable, whether it is in a function or in a class definition or just free floating in the global space as we see here, we can drop all vowels and double consonants. And in this case, we could change to a camel case called user inf, or if you really wanted to, put in an O. Now, the point I want to make here is that Hungarian notation is about allowing us to keep track of what has been assigned to our names. And although Python is a very strongly typed language, the variables are typeless. And in my opinion, like with many other scripting languages, the need to encode the expected type becomes even more important when we can switch between an instance of a class, or perhaps a string, a character, a float, or any other type we need whatsoever. Like the other names that we demonstrated, using Hungarian notation is not part of the PEP standard, and inasmuch as the standard itself says that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, I think the idea of using Hungarian notation is pretty nice. And to save a little typing, I like dropping the underscore, because if I was going to do a similar type of thing, in the spirit of PEP-8, although once again Hungarian notation isn't part of PEP-8, what we would do, of course, was more like we see here, by putting an I for integer, F for float, or even an S, which to me is a lot of typing. And while it looks a little bit more Pythonic, other software developers may be more comfortable seeing our variable names expressed a little more succinctly. So rather than antagonize people whenever I start using my Microsoft and Oracle or Java way of doing business, it's always good to go with what other people are doing. But keeping in mind, coding standards are not something that need to be the same for everybody all the time, but should be subject to the requirement of your team. And in a like manner, whenever I have a static method, I like to use Camel Case. Now, under PEP-8, since all variables, functions, and methods have got to be named the same, in other words, what we should do, if I were going to keep with PEP-8, is to have our words separated by underscore and all being lowercase. The reason why I prefer to use my factory, of course, is that, one, for philosophical reasons, whenever we have a class, we actually have a recipe and we don't have an instance. And the same thing can hold true, certainly for static method, and arguably less true for class method. But whenever I get to my integrated development environment, most IDEs will present my classes with the names of the functions sorted, so I can avoid the confusion between having my factory, which is a static method, obviously going to create something, and perhaps a my factory using the PEP-8 recommended to our params. So inasmuch as Python is nothing if not changing all the time, I wanted to introduce you to these concepts. And by way of review, at the time of this recording, the suggestion for variables, functions, and method names, that they should always be lowercase words, either one or many, separated by underscores. And we're pretty much expecting to see that moving forward with Python 3. Classes are Camel Case with no underscores. A constant, for example, defining something globally, follows the wonderful C and C++ convention. All uppercase words, once again, separated by underscores. And interestingly, this caused people a lot of trouble recently, modules should be lowercase words, one or many, and they should be short, and modules are separated by underscores, whereas packages, or what is on our folders, should be lowercase words, and for operating system reasons, I speculate they should not be separated by underscores. My personal way of doing business, which may work their way into PEP-8 or may not, is to keep a Hungarian notation spirit, not necessarily strictly Hungarian notation, which comes from our name mangling in C and C++, or name decorating as Microsoft calls it, so we can keep track of what's going on in our code, certainly as our code becomes more complex, and either Hungarian notation itself, but more importantly, the big change I think that I like to see across my code is the ability to see what is static, so I match up my static names to look and feel a lot like our classes. So keep in mind, no matter what you choose to do, the standard itself warns us about being hobgoblins. In other words, to make sure that we're not being consistent just for its own sake. And in the spirit of that very sage advice, I'd like to consider that the customer is always right. And more importantly, standards are prone to change. And until those icons get a little bit larger in the IDE so you can see which is static and dynamic, I prefer to have Camel Case working with my functions. And I like to use Hungarian notation a lot, but that doesn't preclude me from paying homage to the wonderful insight of consistency whenever we're using the PEP-8 standards. Thanks for listening. Happy coding. And I am indeed looking forward to seeing you in the professional software development world.